Hi, welcome to session two of the fourth topic of the semester titled Popular Reform Movements from 1890 to 1920. So, this is going to be the second session that will continue looking at the social groups that are going to be very much active in the late 19th, early 20th centuries in the United States in terms of organizing into clubs and organizations of various kinds, and also creating political parties for the purpose of bringing about reform in the United States, bringing about reform, particularly in the political and economic system, but also, again, in American society, particularly in the American cities, trying to reform the city, the new industrial cities. So, again, this is going to be a very, very characteristic period of time in which reform was in the air. This is what most people are talking about. This is the central theme of political discourse. And this is what is bringing people together to create, again, movements, reform movements in this case. And again, as we indicated in the first session, we're going to look at three particular groups. The American farmers, the industrial working class, industrial workers, and also the middle class. And so far, we have looked at the farmers and looking at the background of the agrarian movement. We have not yet seen, for example, what are going to be the results, the accomplishments of the agrarian movement, but we paid attention very closely to the problems or obstacles that the American farmers were facing during this time as they tried to transition towards this new modern industrial economy and society, many of which many farmers were actually attempting to transform their farms into commercial farms. And in doing so, again, they're going to experience a series of difficulties. They really wanted to participate in this new economy. They wanted to go into business. So they're attempting to really now transform their family farms into now commercial farms by, investing in technologies, modernizing, the agricultural machineries again, to actually mass produce crops for the market. And in doing so, they're going to, of course, run into a series of problems as they're trying to transition again into this new mode of production, mass production, and trying to maximize output and trying to, of course, produce as much food as possible for the growing cities. Again, we're looking at some of the problems they're going to be facing. For example, the expensive machinery, of course, was so expensive. That had to be bought on credit, and the credit was only obtained if the farmers kind of pawned, if you will, their farms, got a mortgage on it to obtain those loans. And again, about 50% of the American farmers ended up losing their farms and became tenant farmers during this process, again, paying rent on their farms because they fell behind as a result of overproduction. The overproduction of food products is going to lead to this problem. Transportation cost, paying for, railroad fees, rates were quite elevated during that time. And of course, that's going to be another problem. And the middleman, we looked at the middleman as well, buying as low as possible and selling the product as at a higher price in the city. And so farmers were affected because they were actually underselling their product. And we also were looking at, again, the gold standard that restricted credit. Many farmers were not really able to obtain credit because of the gold standard. And of course, natural catastrophes and natural calamities, of course, also affected many farmers during this time, like droughts and blizzards and the like, tornadoes, etc. So They became very organized. In the late 1860s, we're going to see farmers building their own grassroots organizations, like the Grunge in Texas, that function as a collective. Again, groups that actually um, created certain concerted actions. They agreed to actually pursue certain course of action that all the members had to follow. That is to say, like withholding grain, for example. This is again kind of the strategies of the grunge, withholding grain in order to increase the price of the product. They will store it, withhold it from the market in order to control their own product. Again, this is a typical strategy that many farmers were employing during this time. And again, there's going to be so many of those organizations scattered across the country in the 1870s that will come together in the late 1870s under a National Farmers Alliance that is now presenting a very organized, very planned, of course, series of reforms that they believe were going to solve the issue of the farmers in the countryside, such as, for example, the introduction of silver currency. They want to inflate the currency by also adopting a silver dollar, the creation of farmers' banks that farmers are going to control, issue credit to other farmers at low interest rates to spend it on, again, on things like machinery or payback loans, etc. And also, they're suggesting also the regulation of railroad companies in terms of the government stepping in and trying to tell the railroad companies to lower their transportation rates so producers like farmers can have more profit margin, in other words, and not spend so much on transporting their product to the cities, etc. So we were looking at that. And again, this is again now in the late 19th century, giving rise to something called the agrarian movement. Farmers are becoming highly organized. They're coming together, forming a national alliance, and they're writing letters to Congress, petitioning Congress, the representatives, the senators, the members of Congress, petitioning, of course, to actually introduce those reforms so the American farmer can have a chance to succeed in this new economy. Now, let's move to the second part, again, that is going to look at the industrial workers. This is a second group, a second social group that is also going to experience a series of difficulties in this new industrial society, in this new industrial economy. And most of those difficulties were experienced at the workplace. And as a result of that, because they have a shared experience, whatever, again, the industry might be, whatever the factory, whatever the sector, the industrial sector they might be working, because there's so many different industries in the United States. There's a shared experience, again, among all of those workers that they feel that if certain reforms are introduced in the industrial system, that their lives were going to improve significantly. So they don't really want to do away with industry. This is, again, an industrial revolution that is taking place and that is here to stay. But what they want is to improve it. That is to say, to upgrade it, to make it better. So their experiences, their working experiences, their life experiences can be significantly improved as well. So again, let's look at the industrial workers and how certain conditions at the workplace are going to affect them in a way that they're also going to become highly organized, just like the farmers. And in doing so, they're going to launch what in American history is known as the labor movement. Okay, the labor movement, just like there was an agrarian movement, a movement of farmers, there was also a movement of industrial workers, otherwise known as the labor movement. And this is something that was becoming highly, highly noticeable in the late 19th century. Okay, so let's look at the background. This is going to be a similar exercise in terms of looking at what were the factors, the conditions that were so typical during this time that industrial workers were living, they were experiencing, and that are going to motivate them to come together and create this movement, the so-called labor movement. So let's look at the background, okay? So there's a series, of course, of different issues that they're going to be affected by. So, so first and foremost, let me just begin by saying that the industrial workers, it's really a new social group that had risen with the Industrial Revolution. Again, this is really a group that was born directly from the Industrial Revolution that started back in the 1700s in England, and it began to spread into different places. We already talked about that. So the industrial working class as such did not exist prior to the Industrial Revolution because there were no industries. I mean, that's just, again, a given. So this is a relatively new social group that came about with the rapid spread of factories, industrial plants, construction of railroads, mining operations of various kinds, and the like. So all of those people that were working in the new industry that we already covered quite thoroughly in the past will become part of the industrial working class, by the way. So another thing to contemplate here is essential to contemplate is that the first industrial working class was born out of farmers that were migrating into the cities. In other words, that the first industrial working class in history came from people that were living the life of the farm, that were actually growing crops. Okay, they were living in farming within farming families and farming settlements and communities. And that some of those farmers perhaps had the aspiration of pursuing a different life path away from the farm, because the city was very attractive and kind of offered new opportunities for them to experience different things, different forms of living, different forms of work, and of course, cash payment, wages, that is to say. This is not to say that farmers in the past did not have cash. They did, but it was not something that they earned in terms of them being paid on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. Okay, the wage labor system came with the Industrial Revolution, came with capitalism. It was introduced. I mean, the idea that people can actually earn their living with, through the payment of wages. So farmers did not really earn wages in the past. They didn't have that cash at hand. They were just simply living off the land, growing their own food, and trading any surplus, for, some other products, bartering some other products for tools or clothing, or maybe selling it on the market if they had a surplus, that is to say. So, of course, the new industrial cities provided, of course, the opportunity to earn wages, to have cash, in other words, and to enjoy the life of the city. In other words, look, I'm going to migrate to the city because there's work available there. I can be hired. There's a certain sense of security in that you're going to be employed on a permanent basis to perform certain functions, and at the end of the month, etc., whatever the arrangement is, you're going to be paid for your labor. You can actually live in the city and cover all your expenses with those wages, etc. Again, and of course, there's so many things that the city has to offer. You're going to live with other people there, meet new people. You're going to come, in very close contact with the new technologies that are coming about. There's also centers of learning, museums. There's, of course, again, the city was, the kind of the center of civilization. This is where the knowledge, the science, the arts are being generated. So it was actually very attractive for a lot of people to see the city as the place where they could actually progress. If I can just move there, get a job, work in those industries, I can improve my life. That is to say, maybe down the road, I can actually, educate myself, and probably my children are going to go to school there, etc. Again, so there was, just a futuristic vision, that presented so many different opportunities for the people that live outside of the city. And of course, farmers are going to be very much attracted to that. So it is when we see those massive migrations again of farmers into those industrial cities that they're going to become part of the working class, a great many of them. Okay, so that's one thing to contemplate. But the other thing to contemplate is that as those workers went into those cities and began to work in those factories and industrial plants, etc., they experience a dramatic shift in the way they used to live back in the farm. That livelihood, that style, those experience again of working the land, being outdoors, being in touch with nature, with the elements, and so on and so forth. And that farmers, when they were back again in the age of when they were actually back in the countryside, growing crops, living with their families, they were also very much in tune with the rhythms of the natural cycles, the seasons, that is to say. The way that they organized their work as a farmer was by really following the patterns again of nature in terms of the seasons. There's a planting season, for example, that's spring. That is the time of the year that you're going to be active, preparing the fields, clearing the fields for the cultivation of the seeds, and so on. And farmers work in groups, by the way. And they work in families. Again, people will go with their, if you have a family, for example, you'll take your children or relatives to go out again and, work the land as a family. Again, they're helping you. So again, you work with the seasons. There's a planting season that's during spring. Then you take care of the fields during summertime. There's a harvest season that's fall. And during the winter, for the most part, there's rest, for 3 months or so, when there's nothing that can be grown because it's freezing, it's just too cold. Farmers also stay behind and, spend a significant amount of time in other activities, whether they're spending time with the family, whether they're working in their own houses and fixing, for example, whatever needs to be fixed in their homes and warehouses, a barn, etc. Perhaps learning a new trade, etc. Again, so they have plenty of free time during winter time to attend to other activities, again, family-wise or otherwise. So they're very tied to the rhythms, again, of nature, the cycles of nature, the seasons. And they also rise up with the sun. Whenever they're going to go into the fields, there's a sunrise and they wake up, they go to the fields, and they come back at sunset. Okay, so they're not really governed by any clocks, artificial mechanical clock, but rather, the clock of nature, the natural clock, if you will. So it's a very different mode of living. It's more in contact, more in tune with the elements of nature. They're in constant contact with the air, the open atmosphere, with the wind, for example, the rain, the moisture. They pretty much understand when there's going to rain. They can know in advance, sometimes days in advance, when there's going to be rain, etc. Because they're very much, again, sensitive to those elements. So this is not to say that this was the ideal existence. I'm trying to romanticize the life of the farmer, but what I'm trying to say is that their life, their livelihood, their mode of living was very different from the one that they're going to experience as they're going to be moving into the city. they're gonna walk into, again, a very crowded environment. Cities are now going into the hundreds of thousands, and by the turn of the century into the millions of people, residents living there. So again, they're quite crowded environments, and also that they're going to be working indoors. In many cases, they're going to be working inside of buildings, inside of factories, and they're going to spend most of their day there. Okay, by the way, and also that their time is not going to be organized around the cycles of nature. Okay, but rather is going to be organized under a mechanical clock. Okay, there's going to be a mechanical clock that is going to be used to organize work in the city. There's a certain time you have to be at work. You have to punch in a certain time, work until noon, then have a lunch break. You punch out, eat, punch back in, to go back to work, and then when you leave, you also punch out, and so on and so forth. Again, so industrial society is going to be organized in a very mechanical fashion. Because this is the Industrial Revolution. This is the age of the machines. The machines are the ones, again, used to produce the products that society consumes and needs. And likewise, machines are going to be used to organize, again, work, like the industrial clock, by the way. This is a whole different environment. Okay, it's a new setting, and it's a new social setting altogether that we have to account for. And again, the life experiences of the industrial workers in the cities are going to give them the sense that life was becoming quite mechanical, by the way, and that they were spending, of course, long working hours. Okay, inside of the workplace, inside of a factory. Well, back then there was not a maximum working day, maximum hour working day. So there was no set limits established anywhere to say, well, the maximum amount of hours that a worker can spend, in a factory is 8 hours or 10 hours, etc. Because the Industrial Revolution, the way that it emerged in history was just very improvised. A merchant will have capital, buy land, build a building or a factory or a plant there, bring in machinery and bring people there, hire them to pay them a wage. And that was, again, how it all got started. So there was not a lot of industrial planning per se to say, oh, this is the way that the building has to be structured and organized, and this is the ideal, limit for workers to be inside of those buildings, the ideal time limit, for example, like 8 hours, etc. So there was nothing like that, of course, not yet. Okay, so again, workers usually spend 12 to 14 hours in those places, working from, again, the morning to all the way to the evening. That was very typical, anywhere from 12 to 14 hours, long working hours. So this is extremely important because what is going to happen is that by the time they're going to go back home, they're not going to feel so much enthusiastic or energized to spend to spend time with their family. Okay, because they're tired. What they want to do is just go back home, perhaps take a bath and go back to, just go to bed. And then of course the next day will be the same thing again, over and over again. So they are going to, of course, experience exhaustion, in other words, in that rhythm, that they're no longer following the seasons of nature, but life was becoming very mechanical. And inside of the factory, they're operating machines. So they're the ones actually operating the machines, etc. And they're surrounded by other machines, and their time is also organized in a kind of mechanical way. So when they go back home, once again, they just don't feel, that they want to spend time with their family, doing certain activities, etc., because they're tired. So they're going to be affected. This time of format, this time of framework is going to affect their family experiences, the quality of their family experiences, their social life. In other words, their social life is also going to be constricted because they're spending most of the day at work. And so, again, this is of course captured in the Wizard of Oz. This condition of the industrial worker that is being represented by the Tin Man. By the way, is like a sort of robot. In that, the problem of the Tin Man in the Wizard of Oz is that he lacked a heart. Okay, he lacked a heart because the industrial worker was losing the ability to feel emotions, to develop and nurture social links, social bonds with their fellow human beings, particularly with their loved ones, with their family members, because the industrial worker felt, that he was becoming more and more like a machine, that is to say, living a mechanical life, operating different machines, spending most of the day there, and having no time to be human. Again, humans, we're social creatures. We need to develop relationships. We need to develop social relationships to feel truly human. Again, it's part of the human experience. So this is what the industrial working class is going to experience. They're going to share in common that, again, there were just simply long working hours there at the workplace. And of course, from the standpoint of efficiency, this was not a very efficient system anyways, not even for the employer, because what that entailed is that many workers were simply so exhausted, so tired. Many of them were, falling asleep at the workplace. Okay. They were taking bath breaks, going to the restroom, and just falling asleep there because they were exhausted. Of course, that leads to a lot of mistakes inside of the workforce and accidents, etc. So this is not a very efficient system. So some reform needed to be introduced in order to make the system work, both for the employer to make it more efficient, and also for the worker to better the quality of life of the worker. The other, of course, issue is the issue of, again, wages. There was no standard minimum wage during this time. There was a discrepancy from factory to factory, even within the same city. So I'm not actually speaking about, discrepancies from state to state, but rather even in the same city where there's different industries and factories, they had different standards, if you will. So there was no minimum wage law, in other words, during this time. And of course, the common experience is that many of those workers experience low wages, of course. That's another issue. Again, number three, like I said, it's the Industrial Revolution. The way factories, industrial plants were built from the start is that they came about in a very improvised manner. There was not necessarily a lot of planning taking place. The field of industrial engineering, for example, had not yet been developed as such. Not that there were no engineers back then. They were a lot of engineers in other fields, engineering, of course, but industrial engineers, the ones that are going to be, building the industrial plants and making sure that they will be organized and structured in specific ways to really provide the maximum, amount of safety guidelines, for example, safety conditions for the workers and for the employers, by the way, that were there as well. So all of that had not yet developed. So, of course, what is going to happen is that industrial workers experience also that the way those factories, industrial plants were built is that they just lack, of course, some basic requirements that will provide, of course, safety conditions to the people working there. They pretty much were enclosed for the most part. They were, because of the machinery that was being operated there, the ovens, etc. In many cases, those were actually places that were 90 degrees Fahrenheit and over. Again, it's just too hot to be working inside of those buildings, of course. In many cases, they were unventilated. They lacked, of course, extractors, for the fumes and the chemicals that were present there because of, the materials that were being manufactured and processed that were releasing certain, particles of dust and chemicals, etc., or vapors, fumes of various kinds. And again, people were not really wearing, the proper, gear, again, to protect themselves, to protect their lungs, to protect their skin and the like, to protect their eyes, etc. So all of that is going to be, again, innovated, by the way. But what I'm actually referring here is that, of course, workers are going to be the ones that are going to actually express the problems of industry that will lead to reform eventually. So again, there will be reform, by the way. But again, those are the typical problems that the industrial working class experiences. Of course, no insurance or compensation was another typical issue. That there was no health insurance back then whenever you get hired at a workplace. Again, this is going to come, of course, in the 20th century. The issue of employers being liable to provide health insurance to the employees, to the workers, and also whenever they suffer an accident, that they were also liable to provide compensation to cover the medical expenses, the treatment, the medication, the surgeries, whatever they needed, again, from that particular accident. That is to say, it's called compensation. So those two, health insurance and compensation, were not yet introduced in industries. And of course, industrial workers are going to be the ones that are going to, insist that this is greatly needed, necessary to improve industry, to make it better, to upgrade it. That is to say, to make it function as it should. That is to say. Number 5, and that's another issue that the industrial working class is going to voice and express, is the issue of child labor and also prison labor. Okay, so during this time, there was no bias or prejudice, not yet, against child labor. Okay, in other words, compared to today. Okay, so today when we hear child labor being practiced anywhere in the world, we were very much alarmed about that because the values have changed dramatically in the past 100 and 120 years or so. Because when you look at the 19th century, particularly when you look at the 19th century and before the 19th century, child labor was not seen as an ill, okay, of society, that this was something wrong, with society allowing child labor, but rather it was seen as a virtue in the past, because families, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and even thousands of years, function as an enterprise. Okay, and families around the world. I'm not actually just referring to one country in particular, but really the family unit, okay, which is the basic unit of society. When you look all over the world, it was actually an economic enterprise, okay, in which the way that families succeeded all over the world is that every member of society needed to sustain the economic conditions, the economic welfare, the economic necessities, needs of the entire family. They needed to contribute, they needed to work, they needed to produce something. Whether they were farmers, so they will work together, or a family of merchants, they all work together, help each other, in the family business, etc. Whatever the family was in charge of, family of artisans, and so on and so forth. So it was expected that, again, since very early age, children will be taught the trade of the father, the trade of the mother. If you were a daughter, for example, you would learn the trade from your mother, from your grandmother, from your aunts, and carry on the traditions, of course, the type of work that they did for the family. That is to say, so since very early age, they needed to be disciplined. again, to contribute. So when the Industrial Revolution came about, children also wanted to sustain their families. They wanted to go out there, also earn wages to supplement the wages of their parents to help them out, okay, in the household, cover expenses and the like. So the more the family members were engaged in work and contributing to the family enterprise, to the family welfare, the best. So once again, we have to understand that the proper historical context in which certain practices were carried out, like child labor, we have to understand that in the past it was not seen necessarily as an ill, but as a virtue. But the rigors of industry were far different from, let's say, the rigors of agriculture. The expectation again in industry is, again, think of those long hours, 12 to 14 hours for a child, okay, to be there ongoing on and on and on, or in a mine, for example, to be mining for coal or iron ore. So the situation, the kind of work had changed. It became far more rigorous. That is to say, that it exerted a heavier toll again on the human organism, that children were not really prepared for that type of work. But also that what we see is that there's now, again, a public education system in the United States. The modern industrial societies are societies that are scientifically oriented, technologically oriented, and what they're trying to do is educate the population in the new science with the new knowledge, so they can in the future innovate new technologies. That is to say, this is a technological age, so the values are changing in that people are beginning to see that it will be far more valuable, to send children to school than to send them to work. That is to say, okay, because things have changed. We're living now in a new society. It's an industrial society that people value knowledge and technology. And also because the work in industry is far more burdensome, more rigorous, that it will be better for children to stay out of that, of course, that environment, and go to school. So they can be literate, so they can read and write, learn mathematics, learn physics, science, and you're investing in the future, because they're going to become the brain center, the people that will formulate the new ideas, the new tools of the future to improve society, to create progress. So, of course, the idea of ending child labor, of course, is going to resonate with society at large in the United States, because many people see that, again, this type of practice needed to end in order to enter the 20th century and upgrade the society, invest in education, in other words, okay? And also prison labor. Prison labor is also going to be an issue that industrial workers are going to voice, because the common practice back during this time was that prisoners needed to provide some form of contributions to society, what we call community service. That instead of just being, kept in a cell in a prison and be sustained there year after year, that they needed to return something back to society. Of course, do something for society, like cleaning the streets, or doing, things for the community, like, building a road, etc. Improvements, if you will, community improvements. So this was common, of course, in the 19th century. But because there was a need for labor, what is going to happen is that many companies began to make contracts with many of the prisons in order to use prisoners to do work that could be done by other people that had, of course, no criminal record. They were not prisoners of any kind, and that they can actually be hired and be paid a wage to do that kind of work, whether it was construction work, railroad construction, etc., various types of activities, mining, and so on. And prisoners were doing that. So they were driving down wages, because, why would you pay, of course, somebody a wage when you can actually hire somebody to do it for free? After all, prisoners were not really, again, earning any wages. So again, this is going to be another issue affecting the industrial working class, that they want to see the end of prison labor to improve wages, but also to reform prisoners. That instead of having them work in those community and community projects, that there could be perhaps a system of therapy, for example, providing therapy, providing assistance to the prisoners so they can reform themselves and so they can be reintegrated back in society. After all, we have now, a field of psychology. They said, well, you have a mental health. There's perhaps maybe something we can do for the workers, for the prisoners, to improve their lives, in other words. All right, so this is going to lead then to the rise of the labor movement. So this was a grand introduction again to the problem of the industrial working class in the United States. I provided a very thorough, of course, analysis of what workers experience as they transition from the life of the farm, working outdoors, being in touch with the elements of nature, following the seasons, the rhythms of nature, to now transition into a city that is overcrowded, and that they're going to be operating machines, and their life is going to be very mechanical, very mechanized, governed by an industrial clock, spending 12 to 14 hours at the workplace, with the low wages. For example, there was no minimum wage law, in the country, and the working conditions, etc., that we experienced, we talked about inside of the workplace were also, again, quite severe. The high temperatures, the fumes, and the like, etc. And of course, the issue of child labor and prison labor. Of course, that is going to bring workers together, of course, to also create their own clubs or organizations. Because as I mentioned in the first session, people come together and form groups whenever people experience difficulties, hardships, challenges of different kinds. And it is just human nature that people feel that it is better to overcome those challenges when they're in a group. They feel safer, they feel more secure, they can support each other, they can help each other accomplish whatever needs to be accomplished again. So again, this is something that farmers did. This we covered in session 1, but also industrial workers are going to follow suit and also create their own clubs, if you will, that over time they're going to grow and they're going to create a national movement, otherwise known as the labor movement. And the labor movement, of course, began to occur in the 1860s after the Civil War, roughly at the same period of time when we saw the formation of the first farmers organization, like the Grange, for example, in Texas in the late 1860s. Is around the same time when we're going to see the rise of trade unions in the industrial cities. Again, trade unions. This is the name, the term for the kind of organization that industrial workers created for the purpose of helping each other. So what a trade union was in the very early stages of the labor movement is really a union of workers that belong to the same trade. Okay, so I know it's redundant, but those are workers that actually operate in the same industry. Okay, so there are trade unions of the shoe industry. Okay, so the shoe industry, the workers that work inside of the shoe industry, they are, they share the same experience in terms of belonging to the same trade. Okay, So they pretty much belong to the same category. They have shared knowledge, shared experiences of that particular trade. So they understand each other, that is to say. And there's trade unions for coal mining, coal mining workers, for example, trade unions. They mine for coal or iron ore. There's trade unions for the iron ore industry or railroad industry, meat packing industry. They have their own trade unions because they all work in that particular trade, in their particular industry. Slaughtering houses, for example, another. And so we can go case by case. So there's going to be a multiplicity of different trade unions that are going to arise with the intention of the members of that union to also act as a group. And that's the idea of a union. In other words, we're not going to try to solve our problems as individuals anymore. Let's say you want to raise, okay? You feel your wage is too low, so you want, the company to raise the wages. So are you going to just negotiate that, with your employer on your own, and you think you're going to accomplish that? Or do you think that if workers get together, they're all going to, have a better, of course, chances for success? If there's going to be, of course, a union of workers petitioning, of course, a wage increase, or to do certain reforms of the workplace that, we need safety, for example, safety equipment, for example. Okay, so this is what we petition, and we like the company to give us, of course, the equipment. Or to do certain changes inside of a factory that the workers believe is not very safe. For example, it creates hazards, health hazards, etc. Bring in ventilators, etc. Whatever needs to be reformed. Again, it will be easier. It will be more effective if people do that as a group, that as doing as individuals. Okay, so that's the purpose of the trade union, to bargain, for example, to negotiate with the employer wages or certain changes, etc. Okay, so that is, again, the strategy, okay, of the trade union. And there's going to be, once again, a multiplicity of different trade unions scattered across the country. In almost every industry had its own trade union. So what we're going to see is that in 1869, many of those trade unions are starting to come together under the leadership, again, of an organization that was named back then as the Knights of Labor. Okay, the Knights of Labor are going to try to bring together the trade unions from the different industries, and they're going to start recruiting members so they can actually be now represented by a larger organization. So instead of being just confined to the factory that they form the union and they be working there and be active there, that they're going to now find more and more representation under the Knights of Labor. By 1885, they had recruited already 111,000 members from many different types of trade unions. But finally, it is really in the 1880s that, just like the farmers created a national alliance, a National Farmers Alliance, likewise, in the same decade, in the 1880s, many of those trade unions, many of the members of the Knights of Labor are going to now come together under a larger, more national organization, a more nationwide type of organization, a larger umbrella, if you will, that is going to embrace workers coming from many different types of unions from around the country to come together under the leadership of what is called the American Federation of Labor. This is the equivalent of the National Farmers Alliance, the alliance of farmers across state lines that brought together many of those independent grassroots farmers organizations that now have a national leadership. This is the equivalent of that in the labor movement, the American Federation of Labor, that is to say. And of course, that served that new organization to also present list of demands, again, that workers from around the country are trying to bring about in at the workplace. They're trying to reform industry. In other words, they're trying to reform the industrial structure, the organization, for example, how it's operating, etc., to make life better for the worker, both at the workplace, but also in the social life of the worker as well, family-wise, etc., to better the social conditions, again, the living conditions of the worker. So they're trying to bring about, of course, changes at the workplace in the industry, but also they're also trying to reform certain aspects of the economy as well, of the American economy. So uh, what their demands are going to, this is very similar to what the National Farmers Alliance presented. Again, a series of reforms, petitions that they believe are going to better the life of the farmer. In a very similar fashion, again, the industrial workers are also going to now present a plan, again, that they believe is going to improve the life of the industrial worker in the United States, to improve the workplace and the social life. For example, to overcome low wages, again, they propose a minimum wage law, and that the country require a minimum wage law that will be standard across the United States, that will ensure that workers will earn, again, a wage that will allow them, of course, to live a decent life, of course. Okay. So again, that because there was so much disparity, so many differences, again, from industry to industry, they want to bring a standard minimum wage, okay, law. They also wanted to reduce the 8-hour working day. I'm sorry, the maximum hour working day to be 8 hours. Okay, so they wanted, again, an 8-hour working day instead of being 12 to 14 hours a day. What they wanted was, again, an 8-hour working day, the way it is today. By the way, in fact, we do have a minimum wage law today, and we also have an 8-hour working day. That really originates from the labor movement itself. So again, so when we see when suddenly, again, the 8-hour working day was introduced, or the minimum wage law, and it was during this period of time that we're actually referring to here in the age of reform. So the question is, what is the magic of the 8-hour working day in terms of the number of hours? It's a very important question. In other words, why is it so important, again, to pay attention to the number of hours being 8? And the reason is because during this time, they were already, of course, academics, there were scholars, researchers, scientists, many of them in the fields of health, human health, mental health, biology, and the like, that were trying to understand, of course, the health implications of the type of work that has now risen with industrial revolution, in terms of, for example, studying the chemicals, inside of the factories, and what kind of effects they had on the human organism. So there were already people doing research in that. Again, in other words, how human health is affected by, of course, the new type of work that people are engaged in. And so one of those field of inquiries, one of those questions was, what will be the ideal amount of time for a human being to be engaged in work? Okay. What is the healthiest, okay, time frame for people to be productive, to be very efficient, to be focused, and to be healthy at the same time? So again, under several studies and researchers, again, many of them in the field of psychology, for example, the field of medicine, it was now concluded that the ideal form of time management for a human being was to divide the 24-hour day in three parts, in three sections, each consisting, of course, of 8 hours. Uh, again, this is a kind of like a scientific model, so to speak, that was coming, to the surface during this time, in terms of saying, well, the ideal amount of time for people to be engaged in work, to be productive, by the way, and to be focused, it will be 8 hours. After the 8 hour, the efficiency starts to break down, the focus, you start to break down as well. You start growing tired. You're not going to be very productive. You're going to be falling asleep at the workplace because, again, the human brain can only sustain attention and focus, just a certain amount of time. After that, again, the brain is just tired. In other words, and that, of course, leaves humans to step out of work after 8 hours of work to engage in other activities. So you have an additional 8 hours to be, of course, engaged in some other type of activity that will allow you to grow as a human being, whether it's to learn a new trade, go to school, for example, maybe, take a night class, etc., try to, educate yourself, earn a university degree, or be with your family and nurture relationships with your family and so on. Spend time with your children, with your spouse, etc. And that will, of course, nurture that side of you, that social side of human beings, of course, that is so essential, that makes us human. Again, so you can grow intellectually, academically, artistically, you can grow socially. You have an 8 hours, again, of growth that you can spend it. And also, of course, the 8 hours of sleep that is considered to be, give and take, the healthiest amount of time to rest and recover and repair. That is to say, so it was, again, the age of science was also introducing the ideas that the labor movement is going to draw upon in order to reorganize the workplace and say what we need is an 8 hour working day because this is the healthiest, way. And of course, employers are also going to follow suit with this because they realize that 8 hours, made work very, very efficient and productive with less accidents, less mistakes. And of course, the company is not going to be losing so much, resources because the workers are simply falling asleep at the workplace after 8 hours, etc. So again, this is going to be part of this new mentality, this new scientific age that is going to start reorganizing people, society, work in a more efficient manner. Of course, so the other demand will be equal pay for men, women. Men and women earn different wages. Men earn, slightly more uh, per hour than women for literally doing the same task and working in the same industry. Okay, so again, there's going to be also within the labor movement, the rise of the feminist movement, which, by the way, the feminist movement was part of the middle class movement we're going to actually analyze after the labor movement. But inside of the labor movement, there were petitions, there were, of course, demands by women to have equal pay. Again, because they were really doing the same type of job, engaged in the same task with men, and even in that situation, they were earning less. Of course, the abolition of child and prison labor will be another demand. That is going to be very central to the labor movement. We already explained very thoroughly, what was the rationale behind it. Of course, to make improvements in society, to send children to school, and to reform prisoners, of course, as well. Okay, so there was also, again, this scientific implication embedded in that demand. Is not just, again, to better the industrial working class, which of course it would, but rather it was also to better the life of children, to invest in the future of education, for example, and to try to use the new knowledge of science, of therapy, of psychology to try to address some of the issues that led the people in the prisons to be there. Again, that if they committed certain felonies or crimes, it was because maybe their upbringing, in other words, maybe they had a traumatic childhood, etc., that could be addressed and that they could be reformed, through some form of therapy and attention. So again, the labor movement is so interconnected with the rise of the new science. Once again, that is going to draw upon some of the findings, some of the tools of science in order to try to better society, the life of workers. And of course, another demand was the introduction of a national income tax. This is another demand of the labor movement, that it will become so central to the struggle of the industrial working class, because industrial workers believed that if an income tax was introduced based on how much people were earning, in other words, this is not going to be a flat tax, but rather is it called a graduated income tax based on how much people earn, that the monies that the state is going to receive from that tax can be returned back to society in terms of trying to maybe improve wages, make improvements at the workplace and industry, build better roads or bridges, national improvements and the like, and also to provide certain attention, certain services to the population, to improve, for example, schools, build more schools, for example, to invest in education, for instance, to provide, of course, medical attention to workers that actually suffer accidents and the like, that the state could indeed, in other words, create social programs with the monies receiving from the income tax in order to better society, that is to say. So that was the rationale behind of the national income tax. Now we are in a juncture here after we have seen the rise of the agrarian movement and the labor movement. By the 1890s, the National Alliance of Farmers, National Farmers Alliance, as well as the Federation of Labor, National Federation of Labor, those two national organizations that represented two different social sectors, the farmers and the industrial workers, are going to create a temporary alliance, political alliance, to create a third political party. Okay, a third political party that will be known or named as the People's Party. That was actually founded in 1892. So the reason why this happened is because farmers and workers, ever since they started organizing their collectives, their unions, etc., they were very much engaged in the traditional political parties, whether we're talking about the Republican or the Democratic Party, which were the two main political parties in the United States. And they were trying to work within those political organizations to bring about change. We already explained the kind of reforms they want to introduce. And they were sending letters to Congress year by year, trying to write letters to the senators, to the representatives, to petition changes, again, the changes that we already described quite thoroughly in session 1 and session 2. So they were betting, of course, on those two political parties to represent the needs, the interests of the farmers and the workers, respectively, and that there will be, at some point, some legislation, some laws that were going to be passed and they were going to address the problems again that they face, whether lowering railroad rates, for example, regulating railroad transportation costs, etc., or introducing silver, or creating a minimum wage law, and so on and so forth. So yes, so they're going to be very much involved in those political organizations. But when the 1890s, this decade opened up, there was a feel among the farmers and the workers that they had received no response up to this time, that they did not feel that the two main parties were going to address some of the problems. So their idea is now that they're going to form their own political party to represent the interests of farmers and workers, with the intent that the officials that will be elected under this third party called the People's Party were going to address the needs of workers and farmers and use the office, if you will, as an instrument to implement reforms, to push for legislation, to bring about certain changes at the workplace, to change the laws, in other words, in order to make the life of the worker and the farmer better, in other words. Okay, so again, this is leading to the so-called People's Party. This is a third political party again that is going to arise in 1892 from the alliance of the Knights of Labor and the National Farmers Alliance. So again, the leaders of the Knights of Labor and the National Farmers Alliance are going to meet. They're going to have a political convention in Omaha, Nebraska, okay, to create the party, to bring representatives from the different states. Most of the representatives that are arriving there come from the farming states, and there's going to be, of course, the representatives from the trade unions as well that will be arriving in order to create, of course, this third political party. Now, of course, the name, the People's Party, implied that this was a party really formed, constituted by ordinary people. Okay, farmers and workers see themselves as simply just people, ordinary people with no special status per se. They don't have the prestige again of the middle class or the upper class, the manufacturers, the industrialists, again, the prominent, the high class culture, that they just see themselves as just, in other words, what is commonly referred as today in common terminology as the guys in the street, in other words, the common guy, in other words, we're just the people, in other words. So their philosophy, their political philosophy was centered on the idea that the people had the right to actually be not only responsible for choosing their representatives, but also that the people also had the right to do politics, to be very much engaged in the political process, not just in terms of voting, but in terms of actually accessing political office, that the guy in the street, the common man, the common worker, for example, an ordinary farmer in the United States could indeed become the mayor, again, of a town, or could become a governor, for example, of a state. And to represent the will of the people, to represent the will of the masses, in other words, to carry out the will of the masses, to address their needs. In other words, this is called populism. Again, this is when the people actually create a movement from below. It's called populism, a very popular movement, again, that arises composed of ordinary people, with the idea that the leaders, again, holding office, the elected officials, must come from the very bottom, again, of society, from the very grassroots, from the masses, and that the masses can actually lead as well society. In other words, not just the most educated, the people with most merit, for example, will have the opportunity to access power or political office, or the people that are most successful in business are going to be the only ones, but rather that the ordinary people. Okay, so this is a political philosophy known as populism. Okay, populism is really a popular movement based on the notion that there's certain needs that the people face and that needs to be met, and that there is also the idea in populism that the people can actually access power directly and, of course, govern their own affairs, that is to say. Okay, so this is, again, the phenomenon of the this is the phenomenon of the of this new political party called the People's Party, that sees themselves, again, as just simply ordinary people that are trying to direct their own political destiny. They're trying to actually lead society, access political office in order to represent those that are actually not very privileged, just the ordinary people, again, in the street, whether they're, industrial workers and farmers, again, that they can actually have the capacity to actually, implement policy and so on and so forth. So, again, this is leading to the People's Party and the creation of this party, this third party in Omaha, Nebraska. There's going to be a convention, and they're going to bring about also what is called a party platform. In other words, what a party platform is nothing else than a list of objectives that the party pursues, that the public needs to be informed about, so the people of the United States can know that, oh, there's this third option. You got Democrat, you got Republican, but you also have the People's Party, that is, again, an organization, a political organization, actually constituted by workers and farmers that also feel that they should also access power, political office at the state level, local level, in Congress, and so on. And that they have a series of ideas, they have a series of proposals that they're going to be fighting for. In other words, that if they hold office, whether it's at the local level, state level, or national level, whether it's in Washington, D.C., serving as congressmen and so on, whether they're in the House or in the Senate, or if they happen to nominate somebody for president and wins the presidency, that all elected officials under this party are going to pursue certain bills or certain legislation to go through, to pass it, and to actually bring about reform in the United States. And there's two kinds of reforms, again, that they're trying to implement. The People's Party platform is based, first and foremost, number one, on a series of economic reforms. They want to reform the American economy in a way that it's going to better the conditions of workers and farmers alike. And again, what those economic reforms is centered on was something we already covered quite briefly when we were talking about the agrarian movement and the labor movement. Is very similar. It's pretty much a blend of the ideas of the farmers and the workers put together. And now there's, of course, now a party philosophy, a party platform that they're going to pursue once, again, the members of this party are elected. They're going to be pursuing, of course, economic reform centered on, for example, silver currency, the introduction of silver dollars, that is to say. So they want the US dollar to be based both in gold and also in silver. Okay, what is called a bimetal dollar. Okay, this was the term that people understood back then, what the People's Party was pursuing, to increase the money supply, to provide, an increase in wages for workers so they can be paid more with silver dollars, for example, but also to provide more credit with low interest rate to the farmers to purchase technologies, of course, and the creation of farmers banks. Okay, silver currency. This is first and foremost at the very top of the list, silver. And once again, silver is going to be very central to not only the agrarian movement, but to the People's Party as a whole. This is what the party is trying to accomplish. Silver dollars or silver currency. A graduated income tax. What is graduated means is that they want a tax on income based on yearly income. That is to say, so those that earn more will pay more than those that earn less. And it's not a flat tax that everybody should pay the same amount of money, but those that earn the most, those that have more money or more wealth, should contribute the most to society, to improve society, that is to say. That is the idea. A shorter work week as well. They were talking about, the 8 hour, of course, working day, but also the 5 day week, a working week, in other words, and the work week based on Monday through Friday. So instead of trying to get workers to work also on Saturdays, etc., 6 days out of the week, that instead they wanted a shorter work week as well, 5 days, and the like. Okay, so this is another issue that is going to be presented here. The government ownership of railroads and telegraphs. This is going to be yet another, petition, another idea of the People's Party. They want, the government to not just regulate railroad rates, but they want all of the railroads of the United States to be public transportation system. Okay, to provide, of course, easy access for transporting products produced by farmers, produced by virtually every producer in the United States, that instead of paying huge amounts of money just for transportation costs, that again, that when you have a public transportation system, the railroads, that we're going to have low rates. In other words, it's not going to be totally free, but they will be reduced significantly in the telegraphs as well. And they also want, of course, the confiscation of railroad land grants. When the railroad was built across the West, when, the Pacific railroads that we talked about, the Northern Pacific, the Union Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific railroads, one of the agreements was to build, of course, the rail line all across the continental landmass of the United States to reach the West Coast. But in doing so, the railroad companies were given 2 miles of land on both sides. Wherever the rail line was built, there will be 2 miles of lands that were built on both sides, of course. So there's a huge, of course, amount of land that was given to the railroads that the People's Party is, trying to confiscate in order to provide more land for farmers, for example. That is the idea. Again, that land can be broken up and you can create more farms, more land grants for farmers, etc. So again, this is again in very general terms what the party platform was based on. Let me check the time. So again, those are the economic reforms, but there's also a series of political reforms that they also pursue, not just economic, and that the People's Party is also trying to change the political system. Political reforms, trying to bring about, for example, the idea of secret ballot. Okay, secret ballot. Voting was not necessarily a secret or private exercise in which a citizen will simply be casting a ballot in total privacy and unencumbered, unaffected, by observers. Again, that will inform, of course, the political boss of the city that a certain citizen voted for the wrong candidate. Because back then, cities are run by political bosses, and the political boss of every city is trying to ensure the continuity of the political party in office. In the South, for the most part, is the Democratic Party in the southern states. In the North, for the most part, is the Republican, although there are certain cities that are run by Democrats. But for the most part, is Republican. So they, of course, one of the mechanisms that was used to ensure that people voted for the correct quote unquote candidate was by political boss sending, of course, observers to the voting booths in order to ensure that people were voting for the candidate that the political boss had chosen. And so what the People's Party realized is that if this system continues, there's no secret ballot, there will never be a third party, ever elected in office, because there was always going to be a Democrat or a Republican in office, because people felt pressure to vote for the candidate chosen by the boss, because if they did not vote for that candidate, they were affected. Okay, some of them lost their jobs, for example, etc. The next day they found out that they didn't have a job because they voted for the wrong candidate, in other words. So the political boss pressure employers in the city to actually, of course, fire certain people. Again, so they wanted, of course, a secret ballot to ensure that people simply voted for the candidate that they consider to be most competent, that will bring about the kind of laws or legislation or changes that will benefit them the most, of course. If they are going to have a chance, of course, of winning elections, this political party realizes they needed a secret ballot. In other words, they also want the senators to be elected by the people and not the states. Senators, again, the upper chamber of Congress is really elected at this time by the states. Every state sends 2 senators to Washington, D.C. to represent the state. And the Senate, this is the upper chamber of Congress, is very important because for any law to get passed in Congress, it must be approved by the Senate. Okay, it must be approved. So this is the final door for any legislation. So the People's Party realized that if we're going to bring about any change, if there's going to be any reform, if we want silver currency or regulation of railroads and the like, etc., then it has to be approved by the Senate. So if the states are controlled or run by Democrats or Republicans, there will never be a third-party senator. Okay, never. So what we want is that the senators must be chosen by popular elections, direct election of senators. So they want to, the election of senators to be more democratic, that the people will choose them as opposed to the states. And also they want to introduce something called initiative and referendum. Okay, what is initiative and referendum? Initiative is that people can initiate a bill. Don't wait for Congress to initiate a specific bill, whatever the bill is. If Congress is not discussing a legislation, something that needs to be passed, something that needs to be done, then the people can initiate it. People can initiate a bill, they can initiate a movement, and of course send a bill to Congress for discussion, so congressmen can actually vote on it. So the lawmaking, in other words, process can be more democratic, that the people can also be involved, once against populism, that the people can be involved also in the political process, writing laws directly. Don't wait for the representative to do it, but the people can actually be engaged in the same process of lawmaking. And referendum is the idea that any bill that congressmen cannot decide on, cannot agree, there's a lot of debate, that referendum is the idea that you open up an election process by which people are going to vote yes or no on a specific bill, whatever the bill might be. It's a referendum. So are we going to, for example, back during this time, vote for, let's say, silver currency? Okay, it's just an example. Okay, so a referendum will be, well, let's have an election. Okay, people are going to decide whether we're going to have a silver currency or not. It's just a hypothetical example. It's not a real example, again. But anything that congressmen cannot decide, people can decide through a referendum. So once again, the approval of a law can be done through a popular, participation. That people can participate in the fate in the writing of a bill, initiative, but also voting on a specific bill. Again, those are the political reforms. Once again, so again, when we come back, we're going to actually continue our discussion on populism, the third political party, which, by the way, they're going to compete for the presidency in the election of 1896. The third party, as we'll see in the third session, is almost going to capture the presidency. They're almost going to win the elections. This was the closest that the third party has gotten in U.S. history of actually winning a presidential election. So this is something that we're going to cover, of course, in session 3, along with the progressive movement of the middle class. We're going to spend most of session 3 talking about the middle class movement, the progressive era, and see what kind of reforms the middle class implemented, of course, in this age of reform. That's all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 3. Goodbye.